It always amazes me that Dr. Edwards does this intelligence research, secret background research, and finds things on people like this. You note that some of the previous writing we did was in the turn of the century, 21st time, with a study of arms transfer regulations, and also in the 1990s. Well, of course, it occurs to us that it's time for a reevaluation of what's going on, because that was a time still heavily influenced by the Cold War years, and the pattern of distribution of arms in the world was highly skewed toward the priorities of clearly the U.S. and the Russians, and those two remain the top arms purveyors in world politics. But a lot has happened since then, of course, since the end of the Cold War and even since the 90s that we want to take stock of. So Layton has been great about, getting into that question and trying to see what difference is going on in the world about arms trade and arms transfers. And by the way, that's two different things. Arms trade is for money. Arms transfers can be also aid, shipments and supplies to favored states. But just let me introduce some of these transitional trends that Layton will then dig into to show you what differences there are. So we note that that in the 90s there was a brief period where the U.S. was sort of a dominant country in the world, clearly and far away, hegemonic, as you might say, or unipolar in the world, where we went from a bipolar system with Soviet competition to, a period where the Soviet Union went out of commission, now back as Russia, of course, and determined to get back in terms of nationalism and influence places like the Middle East. So that was a brief interregnum of American dominance, but that was soon followed, of course, by the rise of China as well, to significant status in world politics, the growth of the European Union, where arms are produced and also distributed in collaborative arrangements between often Germany, France, and sometimes Italy and the U.K., when the U.K. was part of it. Probably will still be part of the defense sector production collaborative. And of course the rise of non-state actors in world politics that took place with the shocking events of 2001, 9/11, but all had been in development prior to that as well. Who gets arms? How do they get arms? What do they do with them? And the non-state actors really caused a great deal of concern for the nation states, particularly the extremist groups. And then the world sort of got serious about trying to do a treaty, to do something about this, to establish some level of control or regulation. Now, when we speak of regulations, there have been arms trade and transfer regulations for a long time, even during the Cold War, as the major powers don't really want these kinds of major weapons, especially conventional weapons, certainly nuclear, but we're dealing here today with conventional weapons, to get into so-called wrong hands, out of control, to parties that might use them in unpredictable ways, as if the powers themselves don't do some unpredictable things, of course, along the way. So the question of end users has often been a concern about regulation. We send arms to you. What are you going to do? You promise that you're not going to re-export them to somebody else? And do you not? Is it clear that you're going to make use of them in your own behalf? So re-export is a concern, and use is a concern. Are you going to use them contrary to certain laws? We know that there have been events, and Layton will get into this, where arms, particularly in the Yemen civil war, have been used in very destructive ways, American-supplied arms, let's say, that really are contrary to American export laws. They're not supposed to be used against civilians. They're not supposed to violate human rights. There's all kinds of American export legislation that comes from way back that is sometimes violated. Also the concern about destabilization of a region, so-called stabilization, you know, that's a major power term in a way, meaning that you don't want things getting out of control or wars, you know, just sort of mushrooming in a region. Embargoes have been implemented against certain countries that you're not supposed to trade arms to, based on penalties to them for their so-called misbehavior or failure to go along with things. Countries like Iran were under some sanctions. Some of the countries that, even the Russians came under sanctions, of course, after their Ukrainian adventures later in the period we're going to cover. So there are lots of reasons why countries do want to regulate, and the U.S. has the machinery to do that. Particularly as an example, we have what we call the Foreign Military Sales Program, where that military sales of conventional arms from the U.S. inventory of arms has to be vetted very carefully and reported to Congress. And then there's the commercial sales programs that go from the arms manufacturers directly. But these two, if they're over a certain amount of money, I believe, have to go through vetting and reporting to Congress that they're taking place. There's a certain effort for transparency to try to make sure that arms aren't going out willy-nilly. There's concern about what we call the black markets and gray markets. Arms can fall into the hands of militias and other groups around the world that pick them up off battlefields or from failed states and distribute them. That's in the sort of, and private arms dealers who make a lot of money doing, you know, sort of, not the commercial companies, but just arms brokers who go around collecting used arms and then selling them in profit making. That's part of the black market structure. The gray markets are when countries do sort of strange deals behind the scenes. And arms can go to country A and then they can ship them to countries B and C, and then they get into a war situation with those arms. One of the trends, of course, in world politics, and I'm going to turn this over to Layton here, one of the trends that we've noted is the emergence of civil wars as the predominant kind of fighting in the world. At least the major events, the major gripping warfare has been more and more in the area of civil war, less and less in international war, although there's still, you know, international wars are still around and can be around again. India and Pakistan are still skirmishing. India and China are skirmishing. They're not full-scale wars, thank goodness, but there's threat that they will reemerge across borders. But right now, the big concern is what happens in Syria, what happens in Yemen, what happens in a number of countries where there have been civil fighting, in Africa, let's say, in Nigeria, and so on. Afghanistan just coming out of its long struggles and maybe more. So all of this is of concern, and I'm just going to touch on finally the motives why governments do distribute arms. Sometimes it's for influence with those foreign countries, buying friendship in a way, or showing solidarity. And a lot of arms are distributed within NATO, for instance, to NATO allies. It's a little kind of a club where the expectation is they'll buy American, but they do have alternatives. And I think the Trump administration was very much seeing it as a money-making proposition that they should be buying from us. There's also the whole question of revenue generation to replace research and development funds, which are put into the development of arms. Lockheed, Boeing, whoever the arms manufacturers may be, producing aircraft, missiles or whatever. A lot of this is done on research and development money from the federal government that the government then wants recouped, if possible, from the sales of those companies. In addition, the effort is to have longer production runs. Supposedly arms cost less if they're sold in greater volume than our market, our own armed forces can absorb. So the idea there's a push to export because you want to get the price per unit down if possible, But that, of course, means a lot of arms are awash in the world and maybe not very much controlled. So there's obviously the motive of countering terror, to restrict arms going to groups that may end up with groups or countries that would supply them to groups. Saudi Arabia is a country that has been notable for our concerns along these lines. So there's an interesting array of pro and anti-export motives. And so Layton, I think, is ready to tell us more about how this all pans out.
So yeah, thank you for that introduction. Really quickly, I want to just cover what we talk about when we're talking about arms and arms transfers. A lot of these terms are kind of thrown about in the literature. Arms aren't just conventional small arms like rifles. For the purpose of my research and most research, I'm using the Arms Trade Treaty definition of arms. So this also includes battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, artillery systems, combat aircraft, helicopters, warships, missile launchers, and small arms. These are all kind of in the term of arms. I also use it to talk about military technology, parts, information, artificial intelligence, and advanced robotics that are being used for military purposes. These are all kind of loosely branched under the umbrella term of arms. And like Dr. Pearson said at the beginning, arms transfers and sales are a little bit different. For the purpose of this talk, arms transfers are going to include sales, loans, gifts, shipments between one country and another, or a private manufacturer in a country, or with a non-state armed group. So coming out of the Cold War period into the 21st century, in 2002...
If I could just interrupt,
Yep.
Layton will mention this notion of dual use.
Yep.
The technologies available sometimes are available for peaceful product and another adaptable unit that can be used for war. So.
Yep, yeah, and we'll touch on it a little bit. That can be anything from satellites to pharmaceuticals. These things can be applied both in the civilian world and in the military world. So when we talk about them in the military context, they'll also be under the term arms. So coming into the 21st century, in 2002 we actually saw the lowest global share of arms deals since the 1960s. It was about 17.7 billion globally, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not that much when it comes to arms sales. But then between that time frame and today, we have seen arms sales spike to about 640 billion with the U.S. alone, 85 billion in 2019. These numbers have gone down a little bit due to the coronavirus. Some countries are spending less on arms during this time and more on infrastructure. But this did include a controversial 23 billion deal with Saudi Arabia, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later in more detail, which some of you may have heard about because it kind of stretched two presidential administrations. It looked like it may be blocked for a time, it was frozen, and then we went ahead with it. During this period, it was kind of an attempt of Western powers to, under the guise of democratic peace theory, go into the Middle East and try to stabilize the region. Of course, as we're all aware, this didn't necessarily happen, at least not the way we planned on, and the global shift occurred afterwards. This gives you a visualization of global shares of arms sales. As you can see, for the Cold War, we spiked right about the 80s, and then towards the end of the Cold War, we started to come down, and then we've slowly, gradually started increasing. And again, that dip at the end there could be partly due to the coronavirus pandemic, and we'll see what happens in the next coming years. So during the Cold War, the US and the USSR were responsible for 70% of all global arms sales. France, Germany, and the UK were 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and combined for another 20%. That left the entire rest of the world at about 10% of arms sales. Today, in the last 4 years, the US is still the dominant arms exporter, followed by Russia, France, and Germany. China is somewhere in that top 5. A lot of their arms sales go unreported. Some accounts place them as high as 2nd, above Russia. Some place them about 4th or 5th, but they are in the top 5 now. The United Kingdom has decreased their sales significantly since the Cold War. And then we've seen huge increases in both Israel and South Korea. South Korea in particular with a 210% increase. They're now 9th in the world, and they're very much engaged in sort of the new advanced warfare, AI, advanced robotics stage of military technology, which I'll also touch on a bit later. So this just gives you a little visualization. The U.S. and Russia both still produce over half of the world's arms. If you include Germany and France in there, and then China, there's not much left as far as global shares for the rest of the world. So again, the U.S. and Russia are still the dominant exporter and manufacturer of arms. Russia, in part, is trying to increase these sales again to kind of reestablish itself as a military power. Going back to South Korea, one of the rising states in the arms industry, again, they saw a 210% increase between 2011 and 2020. They're now 9th in the world. One of their most notable arms manufacturing and transfer deals has been the KF-21 Boramae fighter jet. This is done in co-production with Indonesia, which I'll talk about when we talk about co-production, but it's partly an attempt to link all these different states in the Indo-Pacific or South China Sea, try to balance the rise of China, states like North Korea, and try to advance the militaries of countries like Malaysia or the Philippines who might not be able to produce a fighter jet on their own. And they can look to South Korea as a new military manufacturer in the region rather than trying to buy from the U.S. or Russia. And also, this particular fighter jet, within the next 15 years or so, reportedly will have AI capabilities, including to be able to control nearby drones, the fighter jet itself, and targeting using AI. Israel is another increasing state in arms manufacturing. They're 8th, and they saw a 59% increase. One of their most notable productions is the Iron Dome. This is a little visualization down here. It is a missile intercept system. They sold one of these systems to the Czech Republic for $125 million, and there's a potential deal on the table with the U.S. Worth $1 billion. They're also providing a flight academy and training jets to Greece, also trying to make themselves a regional military power, a regional military supplier, and link more military allies in the region rather than rely necessarily on the West or on Russia or the U.S. So towards the end of the Cold War, these were the top importing arms countries in the world, with Iraq leading the group. As you can see, there's a huge focus in the Middle East here. This reflects both the Middle East as a proxy battleground during the Cold War between Russia and the U.S., but also the transition from the Cold War to the 1990s and early 2000s in that kind of democratic peace theory stabilization effort by the West. This has changed in the recent years. These blue countries are the top 3 importers of U.S. arms. The red are Russian. These 2 are Chinese, and then Algeria is a mix of being the 3rd importer of Russian arms and Chinese arms. So as you can see from this visualization, the focus of arms exporters is shifting from the Middle East out into East Asia and the Pacific particularly. For those of you who are keeping up on international relations and world politics and conflict issues, a lot of experts think that the South China Sea is the next kind of flashpoint for conflict. And these arms sales kind of reflect that thinking geostrategically. The U.S. is trying to bolster the arms of both Australia and South Korea, not only against North Korea, but also the rise of China and their reassertion in the Pacific. You also see Saudi Arabia remains the top importer of American arms, in part due to the economic impact. The U.S. can make very high monetary deals with Saudi Arabia. A lot of that money can then go back to the U.S. military. As far as Russia goes, this is kind of indicative of trying to form a tighter alliance with China. Historically, they've been a little bit rocky, but they both view each other kind of as the opponents of U.S. hegemony. As China rises, Russia can kind of bandwagon along with them. Then India, historically, during the Cold War, was a neutral country. It didn't really take a side between the U.S. and Russia. And this may indicate Russia trying to gain more influence with India should conflict arise. As far as China goes, geopolitically, they're trying to bolster the 2 countries on the side of India. This would create, if war did occur, conflicts on all of India's borders. And then also Russia trying to focus on Algeria, in part to kind of encircle the West and the U.S., particularly in North Africa, also to be able to provide aid to Libya and have access to the Mediterranean for naval purposes. So this goes into that in a little more detail. Again, Saudi Arabia, like I mentioned earlier, the Trump administration brokered a deal with Saudi Arabia $85 billion, $23 billion of which was for F-35 fighter jets. It was frozen as the new administration came in, and then was approved and given the green light. And then, as I was mentioning, Australia and South Korea indicates a U.S. focus in South Pacific. This shows you U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia since the 90s. These are not in dollars, but in TVI, trend value indicators, used by most arms tracking databases to kind of universify monetary values throughout the world. But as you can see, since 2010, sales to Saudi Arabia have skyrocketed. They're still increasing, not as significantly, but they're definitely still increasing despite the war in Yemen and other kind of controversial issues regarding U.S. sales to Saudi Arabia. As I mentioned, Russia is competing with the U.S., trying to regain their influence in the world. This is why they're trying to bandwagon on with China. China is also a very big market for Russian arms. It allows them to kind of circumvent the European market that they're no longer as welcome to after Ukraine. It also kind of represents a mutual distrust of the U.S. Again, Algeria, an attempt to outflank the U.S. in North Africa. There's a civil war in Libya with Russia on one side. If they can help, if they can sell arms to Algeria, those arms can then be funneled into Libya. And then China, sales to Bangladesh and Pakistan, like I said, indicate a desire to kind of check the power of India. Should conflict occur, they have allies in all three borders of India, keeping them from rising in the region. And again, similar to Russia, sales to Algeria indicate access to the Mediterranean, access to the European theater, to Italy, and more strength in North Africa as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. For those of you who don't know, it's a very large infrastructure initiative stretching from China throughout the Middle East, into North Africa and Southern Africa, and even reaching into Europe now. So dual-use technology, like we mentioned earlier, this is military technology, or just technology in general that can be applied for the military or in the civilian world. Everything from artificial intelligence to biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, advanced robotics. In our world, in the civilian world, these lead to huge breakthroughs in healthcare, life sciences, engineering, but can also be militarized to significant effect. These can be used in weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, and as we'll discuss a little bit later, this kind of emerging field of AI weaponry. For example, fermenters for vaccines can also be used to produce anthrax. There was a concern, it probably still is during the height of the COVID pandemic, of supplying North Korea with the capabilities to produce vaccines themselves, because those same facilities could be used to produce anthrax spores or other kind of biological weapons after the pandemic. And again, AI can be used to very significantly increase processing speeds in computers and other kind of scientific fields, but it also can be used to power drones, assassination devices, as we'll cover. It can be used to get human control off of borders and conflicted border zones, and can lead to a lot of issues should they progress further. So we want to be able to monitor dual-use technology. One way to do that are end-use regulations. When arms sales are made, the selling country, at least the ones that follow end-use regulations, need to know whether or not those arms are going to be used by hostile groups, terrorist groups, if those arms are going to be resold or retransferred. If they have any indication that that's the case, they should not make those sales. The U.S. has end-use regulations in place. They're not always followed, particularly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There's been cases of militias linked to Al-Qaeda, Salafi militias and other groups that aren't necessarily linked to any governments or under any strict guidance of governments, including armored vehicles. There was the case of the port city of Hodeidah, where Saudi and Emirati forces, militia forces, committed or reported to have committed human rights violations in the city using American sold arms to Saudi Arabia. Co-production. This has allowed a lot of poorer states or less developed states to really get in on advanced warfare and advanced weaponry. This is the idea that the cost of manufacturing new technology, new military technology, lowers if you share it between other countries. So you might have a more advanced country like South Korea, who's going to share some of their military information and technology with poorer states or less developed states like Indonesia, allowing them to have access to new weaponry that they might not otherwise be able to purchase from the US or Russia. Another example is Sweden and Brazil, which we'll touch on here in a moment. This is done partly, the more powerful state, to influence defense policies or transfer policies with the poorer states. It can also be used to create military alliances, to bolster the economies of the poorer states. But it can also be a risk. If you are the dominant state and you're providing information to a poorer state, you have no guarantee that they'll follow through with their deal, and you have no protection if they do take that information and use it in ways that it wasn't intended. So one success story between Sweden and Brazil back in 2017. They created a co-production deal to produce Saab Gripen NG fighter jets, as shown there. It was a very high-tech fighter jet. Sweden gave Brazil Saab jet technology and parts. In return, Brazil was supposed to manufacture the telecom, the front fuselage, brakes, rear fuselage, and wing box. And because of this, Brazil was able to obtain 36 high-powered, high-technology fighter jets. Following the deal, Brazil, who had been kind of standing off on signing and ratifying the Arms Trade Treaty, signed it. So this is indicated that part of the deal may have been that Brazil was to then join the Arms Trade Treaty if Sweden entered this deal with them. Now, an example of cost or a negative deal going wrong, South Korea and Indonesia, that same Boramae fighter jet, was a $7.9 billion project agreed to in 2016. South Korea was going to produce 80% of the budget for this co-production. Indonesia was supposed to supply 20%. In return, they were going to receive 49 fighter jets, the first of which were supposed to be scheduled for flight next year. Unfortunately, Indonesia fell behind in the payments very quickly, fell into debt with South Korea, didn't receive their fighter jets, kept the technology they gained from that deal, and are now in talks from buying jets from France. And South Korea is kind of left with the bill for this project. Now on to regulations. As Dr. Pearson mentioned, in the US we have foreign military sales. These are sales between our military and in foreign countries. So we take arms from our own stockpile and sell them to another country. The potential buyer has to submit a letter of request. The Department of State reviews that request, and Congress must approve the sale. If it is a non-NATO country, for anything over 14 million, Congress must approve. And if it is a NATO member, anything over 25 million, Congress must approve. And with the rise of private arms manufacturing companies, like Raytheon and Boeing, other countries and non-state groups can purchase from them directly. If it is an American business, there is still restrictions. The president has to approve the export and the sale, and we should not make the sales if we know they're going to be in violation of peace treaties or international law, or if they might find themselves in the hands of terrorist groups, or be used for human rights violations. As mentioned earlier, this does not always happen. These rules can be skirted. There aren't really strict enforcement mechanisms in place. The big arms treaty is the Arms Trade Treaty. It was passed by the UN in 2014 basically to prevent the flow of arms in the black market, to enforce end-use agreements, so states would no longer sell arms to countries like Saudi Arabia that would then be used for human rights violations. And I'll speak in a moment how that is not very enforceable. But if any state is aware of the risks that these weapons would be used for any purpose that they're not meant for, the trade is supposed to be unauthorized and unable to go through. There are ways around this, however. But as it stands, 110 states are members to this treaty, including China. And as I mentioned, Brazil recently joined. 31 states, however, are not, including the US, Israel, the UAE, and Turkey, Russia, and Saudi Arabia as well. These are all massive arms manufacturers, importers, and exporters. And obviously, if you want a trade treaty that's going to significantly impact the flow of arms, you need to be able to enforce it with the most powerful states and the most dominant exporters, which is not the case. France, who is a signee, this is indicative of how it's not very well enforced, is continuing to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, despite EU call to ban, despite a call from Germany to ban arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and despite reported uses of French arms for human rights violations in Yemen as well. Another French occurrence happened in Libya, an ongoing civil war. They're basically skirting the rules of the Arms Trade Treaty, selling arms to nearby states like the UAE and Egypt, who are then giving those arms to counter forces under General Haftar in Libya. It's a way for France to kind of skirt the rules of the ATT, not strictly violate because they're selling to UAE, although they know that they're being used in violation of end-use regulations, but it is a way to skirt the treaty. There's a visualization for you. All of the gray states have signed and ratified the Arms Trade Treaty. Afghanistan here was signed. They're yellow because we'll see what happens. It probably will no longer be a member. The blue have signed but not yet ratified, and then the red have not signed in any capacity. So as you can see, there's still a vast amount of the world left that has not joined, as well as the two powerhouse arms manufacturers. So the Arms Trade Treaty kind of has a short reach. It influences and impacts states that we are not necessarily as worried about, say like Sweden, who does create arms and is very influential in arms exports, but it does not impact the significant groups, including 5 of the top 15. As I stated, the US, Russia, Israel, Turkey, and Ukraine. Those 5 alone are responsible for 64% of the arms exports of the top 15 exporters, and they are not enforceable under this treaty. So of the top 15, these are the 15 exporters in 2020. As you can see, a very large portion have not ratified the Arms Trade Treaty. It does not enforce their sales, leaving a vast amount of arms unregulated by the ATT. Another sort of regulatory body is the UN Register of Conventional Arms. This is used to try to make arms trades more transparent, but it is self-reported. Reports rarely ever match. For example, in 1998, the US sold F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. We reported selling 60. Turkey only reported receiving 24. And in 2016, China reported selling 636 missile launcher systems and missiles to Pakistan. Pakistan does not report to the UN Register of Conventional Arms. Therefore, we're not sure how many Chinese missile systems they actually have. Sometimes this is due to errors or units breaking down on the way or transport issues. Other times it's just willfully unreported. Countries don't want the UN to know how many arms they have. So as far as artificial intelligence goes, we talk about dual-use technology. This is kind of the one of the emerging potentially very dangerous dual-use technologies in the fields of arms. There are a few very recent examples of these being used in battle. The first in Libya. Very recently, the UN reported a possible attack using a Turkish Kargu 2 drone. Basically, the way these attack, there's a little kind of cluster warhead on the front of the drone, essentially filled with pellets, like it would be in an IED or a shotgun shell. They can fly and pick out targets themselves, and once they're locked onto a target, they essentially dive bomb and detonate above the target, spreading the pellets or the explosion over the head of the target. The UN is unsure whether or not it was in a loitering munition kind of use. Essentially, that is, you are on a retreat, you have your munitions forming essentially a barricade behind you, and any moving target that comes across that barricade, they will then target and attack. Or whether or not it was launched during a battle, it can actually pick out targets and discern friend from foe. It probably wasn't at that stage, it was probably a loitering munition, but there are certainly AI drone technologies in development that are supposed to be able to target individuals. For example, in Iran, reportedly an Israeli AI-powered assassination system was used to kill Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. We're still not sure exactly how it worked. What we do know is that it was part of a vehicle. It was able to discern using facial recognition Fakhrizadeh in a moving vehicle with his wife sitting right next to him. So it was able to pick out him specifically, not the driver or his wife, which indicates some level of advantage